Hello and welcome to PropNext, the property podcast about all things related to the future of real estate. I'm delighted that you've joined me today. My name is Gavin Morgan, your host. If you'd like to know a little bit more about me, please check out www.propnext.com. That's propnx.com. Or drop me a line if you'd like to chat privately on gavinrmorgan@propnext.com. That's GAVINRMORGAN @propnext.com.
Tim Forman, welcome back to PropNext. Tim, I'm delighted to say you're the first repeat guest that we've had on the podcast. So maybe a quick reintroduction, but obviously a very important topic and an interesting one for today.
Thanks, Gavin. Thanks for having me back. It's an honor. So my name is Tim Forman. I'm a partner in Undivided Ventures, which is a new venture capital fund investing in sustainability solutions for a built environment. And I'm also a senior teaching associate at Cambridge. I teach in the university. I teach sustainable design to built environment professionals of all stripes: engineers, architects, developers, etc.
Yeah. And well, Tim, thank you for that. And today's topic, I mean, you and I, when we spoke previously, agreed that we get back together to talk about the new development versus repurposing of assets. I mean, I think really the concept of stewardship in real estate ownership, rather than build it for a purpose and then knock it down and rebuild it for another purpose. Looking at real estate from a stewardship perspective. And maybe could we start just with what I think would be an interesting, just quick few minutes on where embedded operational carbon occur in sort of from the planning to the development and operation of an asset, and the concept of environmental net gain. Could we start by talking about that a little bit as context?
Certainly, yeah. I think I think we should differentiate at the start between carbon and other environmental concerns, and of course, carbon is on everybody's mind because it's linked to climate change. Probably all too often ignored is the kind of parallel crisis that we're living through, or emergency that we're living through, which is the sort of natural capital crisis. So we know that we're having, unprecedented loss of species, and we're depleting our natural resources, our natural capital. But to your question, I mean, I think anytime we're building, we have to accept that there's going to be an environmental cost, and it can be massive. And for instance, concrete, and we don't know how to build buildings without concrete. Concrete accounts for about 7 or 8% of all of our global CO2 emissions. And that's almost all being used in buildings. And steel, similarly, about half is being used in buildings, but that accounts for another 7 or 8% of our carbon emissions. So, where is that? Where is that going? Where are those materials being used? Well, they're being used in construction. And similarly, anytime we're building, we're depleting natural capital. So we have to find ways of driving down the environmental cost or the toll of building. And very often that simply means avoiding building altogether. Or if we do have to build, it obviously means doing it in very smart ways to minimize the amount of embodied carbon or the energy and carbon that's required to produce a building.
It seems to me that legislation and regulation are really the only way to get this type of thing to change quickly enough. Do you agree with that, or do you think that's an overly sort of heavy-handed way to look at the situation?
No, I do agree. Unfortunately, I think, like everybody else, been waiting for that legislation and regulation and policy to actually make the change that we need, and it simply hasn't. And I've been watching, like many people, for a very long time. I do think it's the case that we have to radically rethink how we do business. We have to redefine the business models in the real estate sector and the design and construction sectors. We have to incentivize retaining those existing structures. And unfortunately, carbon generally is not priced. Maybe about 20% of the carbon emissions in the world are priced, but the vast majority aren't. So really, there's no direct cost at the moment to emitting carbon or depleting natural capital, limiting biodiversity through your practices. And I suppose the problem then is if the client isn't motivated by cost, and the developer or the designer or the constructor isn't necessarily motivated by the cost of that carbon, then somebody has to put a price to that carbon. There has to be a consequence to emitting carbon. Otherwise, people will just continue to do it in free market conditions. So that is, I suppose, where regulation and policy and legislation has to play a role, can play a role, and has to play a role. As I say, unfortunately, it's not happening. We're sitting here as COP27 is proceeding, and it's proceeding maybe better than expected, but still looks like we've got something in the order of 7 times too low, too limited a commitment of resources from countries around the world. So the governments haven't committed the money that it's going to require, which begs the question, who will and under what conditions? And I think, frankly, I think that's an open question. What's really obvious is our carbon emissions are still going up. We're not driving them down quickly enough. Even in the best places in the built environment sector where they are going down, they're not going down anywhere nearly quickly enough to reach net zero by 2050, which we know we need to do. So, big problems and no immediate solutions, really.
Yeah. And you talked about, there are some great signs out there in the private sector. Particularly when you look at the amount of the number of funds that are being raised, where they can only be deployed in assets where there are a variety of different objectives, whether it's net zero carbon or carbon positive. But there's also there's a lot of capital still available out there for unsustainable development, and that will remain the case, I suspect, for quite some time. So that's another capital that we're talking about. Obviously available finance. You talked about natural capital. And when we were talking leading up to this podcast, it was interesting. You mentioned that you'd like to speak not only about natural capital, but social capital and resilience. And you talked to me about those sort of in the context of carbon and climate and reinforcing sort of trends. And you talked about carbon rationales too. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit more on that? Again, from my perspective as well as from the listeners, I'm just interested reading your notes and wanted to hear a little more from you on that.
We talk very often in sustainability about everything being nested and everything being connected. And I think what you've just described is a really good example. So we know that climate resilience, the ability of the planet to maintain a sort of steady, habitable climate, is directly linked to the health of natural systems, so ecology and biological systems. And likewise, therefore, if those systems are affected, then our climate is affected, and vice versa. If our climate is affected, then our natural systems are affected. And of course, we need those systems to live, to eat, to breathe, to have a happy, healthy life. And when those systems fall out of balance, then there are direct impacts on the economy. Crops fail, businesses struggle with extreme weather events, etc. And knock-on impacts then on society and the ability of people to have those happy, healthy lives. So that's why funds like ourselves and Undivided and other groups that are looking at sustainability as a kind of complex, nested issue aren't just focused on climate. We see that the sustainability crises, the resilience crises, are going to certainly require doing something about the carbon, doing more than something about the carbon crisis. But equally, we can't ignore the need for communities that can withstand those effects, the need for a strong local basis of knowledge and training and skills and preparedness, the ability to sort of adapt to the changing climate. Look, I think, unfortunately, climate change is absolutely coming. That's a foregone conclusion now. We had the scientists at the UN this last couple of weeks announcing that the pathway to 1.5 degree future is no longer viable. So what that means, unfortunately, is that the real effects of climate change will come. They are already coming, and they'll continue to come. So we need to start thinking about how we prepare buildings and cities to withstand the effects of climate change. And I think a lot of that has to do with the sort of social value and environmental value, local values. People need to have access to resources and the ability to lead decent lives, even if climate change is coming. So that's very much our focus. And to your point around capital, I completely agree. There's a huge amount of capital flowing around in this space. Unfortunately, a lot of it is kind of not being directed where it's needed most. And I suspect we're going to be, we're seeing that changing already, and we'll continue to see that change. In Europe, we're starting to see the sustainable finance disclosure regulations really driving change. And around the world, we're seeing other sustainability regulations coming into force to shape, I suppose, investment in sustainability priorities. So that gives me a lot of hope. But no doubt, a huge amount more effort and capital is needed today and immediately. 5-10 years from now, it's simply going to be too late.
Yeah, no, it certainly seems that way, and a slightly more fragmented, sort of fractured world politically isn't really helping, which is one of the sad consequences of how things have shaped up over the last 4 or 5 years. Tim, one thing that I thought would be incredibly useful to people in the construction industry, the development industry, landlords, would be a calculator where you could easily compare not just the utility, but the impact of refurbishment versus redevelopment. Have you seen anything out there like that is reliable? And do you think that, it's not a one-size-fits-all industry, but I do think it would be possible to create something that would broadly show the comparison that I do think would prove the case for keeping and fixing rather than tumbling and rebuilding. Your thoughts on that, please?
Absolutely. we are seeing there are more and more databases of carbon values out there, so that if you need to know how much how much carbon would be embodied in a specific building material, for instance, you could generally find a reasonably accurate number. Historically, it's quite famously that data has been really poor quality and patchy, but it's improving. And as a consequence, we are seeing some interesting businesses, some interesting startups trying to work with that data availability, the increased quality of that data. So we're seeing everything from, I suppose, sort of automated carbon accounting software to automated design software that uses embodied carbon values to optimize designs. And those sorts of startups are really exciting to us, of course, in our fund. And I think generally in industry, we are seeing a pivot toward looking for those services. I think the in-house expertise is very expensive to maintain for a developer or an engineer to sort of have in-house expertise in optimizing carbon. So I agree. We certainly do need tools. They're coming, but they're coming, as always, too slowly for the crisis. I think with the uptick in machine readability, machine learning, AI, big data, etc., there's really no reason why we should be grappling with these issues still. It's a matter of time, and thankfully these things are moving quite quickly now.
And have you seen anybody out there who's leading the way on this? I'm looking around, and certainly there. I'm not sure that it's redevelopment, but when I look at some of the things that groups like Lend-Lease are doing, and more specifically the glulam technology that they use to basically create all wood and glass structures on concrete podiums. Several of those very successfully delivered down in Australia. They're fantastic. Not only built using sustainable materials, but they're actually fantastically practical and attractive assets. Not quite what we're talking about, but an interesting step in the redevelopment direction that ticks a lot of the boxes that we're talking about. Have you seen, are there any examples that you're seeing of any groups around the world that are leading the way in good quality refurbishment? One group that has absolutely excelled at that is an old client of mine, Hong Kong Land in Hong Kong, with their central portfolio, which consists of buildings. In some cases, I think buildings that were built in the early 1970s. I think they might predate you and I. And they've done a wonderful job of repurposing and tweaking and adjusting, and certainly more recently with much more of a focus on the environment rather than just tumbling the lot and redeveloping. But I'm wondering, in other parts of the world, are you seeing anyone taking a similar approach and also using that approach to evangelize for the benefits of doing it that way rather than the traditional sort of knockdown or redevelopment?
That's a great question. I think the short answer is yes, but probably, me being a cynic that I am, Gavin, probably not enough. I've seen some great examples of circularity. In other words, reclaiming and reusing building materials. There's a developer I came across recently in London, a small developer called GS8, and they've done developments of 8 or 10 houses without a single skip, without a garbage receptacle. I mean, I've never heard of such a thing. That's incredible, and they're doing that by reclaiming.
I feel like saying how, and I'd love to see that, but it's an incredible
exactly.
feat.
I'd like to see it. Exactly. And I've seen similar projects. I mean, there's a fair amount of this kind of activity in Northern Europe, particularly in the Netherlands. Not exactly your question, but the Netherlands has a fantastic national database. TNO, I believe, is the initialism, which is a database of all available used building materials. So if you're demolishing a building, comes to the end of its life, you can itemize and inventory everything that's coming out of the building. It then gets stored, and the next person who comes along to build the building can access that database and find used materials. I think if we had the ability to build quote unquote new construction with used building materials where appropriate, obviously, and we had a system for testing and specifying and standardizing those used materials and the quality of those materials, we'd be well on our way. Somewhere between a third and 2/3 of a building's lifetime carbon footprint is coming from materials that are going into it. So developers like GS8, the sort of, unfortunately, in my experience, they're the small developers that are doing really innovative, radical things like that. But the likes of Lend-Lease and the tall timber construction that you're talking about, absolutely having a massive impact. I've not seen such a radical approach where there's a whole building being essentially reused. I've not seen at a large scale. I think it's high time that we start to see those major developers. And please, if anybody's listening who's aware of those, I'd love to hear about examples, of major developers doing major buildings with reused materials. I think until we get to truly sort of circularity and a way of optimizing our existing buildings, there's simply no way that we can make a meaningful dent in the climate and nature emergencies. That's just the harsh reality.
But it's, as we talk about all of this, Tim, I mean, I think it starts to lead toward not just an interesting conclusion, but a practical conclusion. Realistically, aligned legislation around the world to force the change that we need in a short space of time, it's probably unlikely to happen. Again, we're in a politically tumultuous world at the moment, so a lot less likely to happen now than it may have been a possibility, probably not 5 or 6 years ago or beyond. So it feels like an appropriate, rather than the topic of today, which is refurbish and reuse rather than redevelop, narrow. It feels like the right way forward here, or a successful way forward for the world, is a combination of that redevelopment, but redeveloping from exclusively reused or repurposed materials, and new construction in situations where new construction can be completely sustainable, in the manner of the sort of glulam, sort of wooden type structures that we've talked about too. And it feels that sort of it feels like commercial forces in the world will push that along, because of the competitiveness that exists, not just between owners of real estate competing for tenants, but also organizations trying to put their people in better places. I mean, there's a whole other force that we haven't talked about today, which is the force of the occupier. And there's a strong body of groups and occupiers, whether it's residential stroke domestic use or commercial use, that are seeking to be in better places where they can perform well and function at an optimal level, which is a big push factor from a group that is very, very important to building owners. So just really concluding with that, Tim, and sort of handing back to you to see if you have any final thoughts for us before we wrap up for today.
I think I'd just like to hit on, maybe just underscore the value of reuse and adaptability. I think our first priority should always be not to build. And that means, I suppose, we need new business models. We need new ways for the people who not just construct the buildings, but sell, manage buildings. We need them to find opportunity in this transition that we're talking about. And I think there are real ways. This isn't just sort of pie in the sky discussion. In fact, I've had conversations with managing directors of major international design, engineering, construction consultancies, and they're thinking the same things. They see the changes coming, and they understand business models will have to change. To your earlier point, let's not forget about policy and the regulation that we need. We've seen successful measures in Europe. I mean, the energy performance certificates and the initiatives to limit the ability to buy and sell the lowest rated buildings for energy efficiency. I think those sorts of mechanisms could drive real change and could incentivize reuse of existing buildings. But we've got to get it right. And everybody knows that things like the energy performance certificates and the regulation in Europe have, while noble as they've been, they've had their teething problems. And we can't just sort of turn our back and say, well, they're okay, but they're not great. We need those mechanisms to be fit for purpose. And I guess the final thing I'll say is that everybody has a role to play here. And I don't think the message at all should be that we need to sort of contract business or that there's necessarily a sort of loss of opportunity in any of this. It's simply a matter of shifting away from business as usual and opening our minds to new ways of doing. I think I'll leave it there, Gavin. There's so much to talk about. I think we could go on for hours, but suffice to say, this is a really rapidly changing world that we're living in.
Yeah, and still, I mean, as you said before, probably one of the most interesting times to be involved in real estate so much. I mean, if we're having this conversation again in 5 years, I'm sure there will have been an incredible amount of change, and most of it for the good too. Tim Forman, thank you very much for joining us again today on PropNex, and hopefully another one again soon. Thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks, Gavin.
So that's a wrap for today's show. I'd like to thank you very much for tuning in to listen today, and hope to welcome you back to hear some of our future shows. As I mentioned earlier, if you'd like to learn a little bit more about me, look at www.propnex.com, that's propnex.com, or drop me a line on gavinrmorgan@propnex.com. That's GAVINRMORGAN@propnex.com. I hope to hear from you soon, and thank you very much again for tuning in today. All the very best.